What if every single thing you believe about reality, I mean, literally everything, from the device you're holding in your hand right now to the concept of time passing as you listen to my voice, what if it's all just a biological survival sketch?
It's a pretty wild thought experiment.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what if everything you look at, everything you touch, is essentially just a low-resolution map, and you've completely, mistaken it for the actual living world?
It is a profoundly unsettling proposition because, if we entertain that idea even for just a second, then all those frameworks we cling to for stability are gone.
Like the absolute foundations we build our lives on.
Exactly. Our relationships, our societies, our laws, they're all suddenly exposed as these illusions of our own making. And we're just left grasping at shadows.
Well, welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're taking on something extraordinary. We're exploring some genuinely mind-bending concepts drawn from the conclusion to the MMK.
That's the Mūlamadhyamakakārikā, for those wondering.
Right, written by the philosopher Nāgārjuna. And our mission for you today is to really try to understand the ultimate illusion of the human mind.
It's a huge undertaking, but it's fascinating.
It really is. We're going to explore how we constantly confuse our conceptual maps for the actual territory of reality. And beyond that, how waking up to this, unwinding this whole biological and philosophical trap can actually dismantle human suffering.
That's the real payoff here. It's not just intellectual gymnastics.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this because diving into this source material felt less like reading a philosophy book and more like my brain was being surgically turned inside out.
I get that a lot when people first read him.
I mean, who's Nāgārjuna? And why is a text from, 2nd century India making me question the solid ground I'm standing on right now?
Well, Nāgārjuna is often considered one of the most important Buddhist philosophers after the historical Buddha himself. He founded the Madhyamaka, or middle way, school of thought.
Okay, middle way, got it.
But it's really crucial to understand that the MMK, the root verses on the middle way, it doesn't read like a typical religious text at all.
No, it really doesn't. It's dense.
It reads way more like advanced formal logic, or even quantum mechanics, honestly. He doesn't just ask us to politely rethink our worldview.
Right. He doesn't just say, hey, maybe look at it this way.
No, he methodically takes a sledgehammer to the very foundation of how human beings process existence. He interrogates causality, time, motion, identity.
All the big ones.
Yeah, he pushes them until they literally collapse under their own weight.
And what's wild to me is that he starts that whole demolition project not in some realm of high abstract philosophy, but essentially right at the root of our biology.
Yes, the cognitive architecture.
Right. The text points to this idea that the human brain isn't actually designed to perceive absolute truth. It's an energy-efficient survival engine. Bing for the African savanna.
Let's look at the biology involved there because it's fascinating. If we consider the evolutionary imperatives of our early ancestors, the brain's primary job was never to understand the intricate quantum nature of the universe.
It just wanted to keep us from getting eaten.
Exactly. The brain is an incredibly expensive organ to run. It makes up maybe 2% of our body weight, but it consumes about 20% of our energy.
Wow, 20%. Just to keep the lights on in there.
Yeah, so it literally cannot afford to process the infinite complexity of reality in real time. Its job is simply to keep the organism alive long enough to reproduce.
Right.
And to do that without starving the body of energy, the brain has to cut major corners. It relies on a fundamental biological mechanism called edge detection.
Edge detection.
Okay.
I want to dig into that because edge detection feels like the absolute linchpin of this whole biological trap. We're talking about visual processing mostly.
Visually, conceptually, neurologically, it operates on every single level. To survive, our ancestors had to project artificial, definite boundaries onto nature.
Okay, paint a picture for me here.
Imagine you're walking through the tall grass of the savanna 100,000 years ago. The visual field in front of you is really just a continuous wave of light, color, shadow, interacting molecules.
But I don't see molecules, obviously.
Right. Your brain cannot process it as a continuous wave. It needs to instantly, sharply distinguish between the grass and the tiger hiding within it. It has to invent a strict binary boundary.
Predator versus prey.
Yes. Safe versus dangerous. And, most fundamentally, self versus other.
Self versus other. So the brain literally assigns a sharp edge to the tiger.
Exactly. So you know where the tiger ends and the environment begins. If it didn't do this, if it just processed raw reality, you would stand there marveling at the interconnected flow of colors until you were lunch.
That's incredible. So you're telling me that my ability to tell the difference between, say, my coffee cup and the table it's sitting on, or the tiger in the grass, is essentially just an evolutionary hack.
In the context of ultimate reality, that is exactly what the text is pointing toward.
It's not that the universe inherently drew a black line around the tiger. It's that my brain needed a line there to trigger adrenaline and make me run.
It is a brilliant, necessary hack. But it's a hack. Reality as it actually is, which the text sometimes calls suchness or tathātā, has no fixed physical boundary lines.
Suchness, I like that word.
That's a great term. At a fundamental level, suchness is a continuous, unbroken flux of interacting energies and dependencies. There are no standalone things floating in a void.
But because of this prehistoric hardwiring, our brains literally demand discrete objects.
Right. We take the continuous field of reality, and we chop it up into manageable, bite-sized pieces. We build a highly practical map over the uncarved territory.
Okay, I was actually trying to explain this to a friend yesterday, and I thought of an analogy. It's like playing a video game.
Okay, let's hear it.
You know those games where if an enemy is approaching, the screen highlights them in this glowing red outline, or like loot you can pick up is highlighted in gold?
Yeah, the visual cues for the player.
Exactly. In the actual code of the game world, that red glow isn't a physical part of the monster's body. It's just a feature of your heads-up display, your HUD.
Right, projected on the screen to keep your character from dying.
Yeah. But we walk around in real life, operating our physical bodies, completely convinced that the red glow, the distinct boundaries we perceive around objects and people, is physically, fundamentally part of the universe.
That analogy captures the delusion perfectly. We have this biological HUD projecting borders, categories, labels, and solidities onto a completely fluid world.
And we just forget the HUD is on.
Over millions of years of evolution, we completely forgot we were wearing the display. We don't realize the screen is even there.
It's just reality to us.
And because we forgot, we started building complex scaffolding, maps on top of maps. We took these highly practical, biologically generated boundaries and started treating them as inherent, independent realities.
And there's a specific term for that in the text, right?
Yes. The central philosophical term Nāgārjuna attacks here is svabhava, which translates roughly to inherent existence or own being.
Own being, meaning that things exist independently on their own side, exactly as our savanna brain chops them up.
Exactly. We think the tiger is a tiger, entirely independent of the grass, the sunlight, its prey, or the observer.
We assume that if we close our eyes, the neatly categorized, boundary-laden world just remains exactly as we mapped it.
We do. And this biological habit of inventing boundaries is the exact foundation upon which we culturally and intellectually construct our entire reality.
Right. We invent a boundary, and then our intellect just runs with it, building civilizations of thought on a totally faulty premise.
Because we couldn't help it. Which brings us to the grand conclusion of the text. This is the core idea. The map is not the territory.
The map is not the territory. It's such a simple phrase, but it has massive implications here.
Nāgārjuna states unequivocally that all of our concepts, our dualities, our models, and our scientific theories are imperfect, dependently co-arisen hypothetical maps.
And the text has shorthand for this, right? T1.
Yes, in the analysis of the text, this is called T1 conventional truth. The core message is that T1 is never, ever the territory, which we call T2 reality as it fundamentally is.
And we really have to look closely at the depth of what he includes in T1, the map. Because it's not just things we casually acknowledge as subjective, like, opinions.
No, it goes way deeper than that. The text lists an exhausting number of dualities that we treat as absolute, undeniable territory.
Give me some examples from the text.
Right and wrong, pure and impure, past, present, and future, cause and effect, the relationship between parts and wholes.
Hold on, wait. You're listing the very metrics by which we navigate our entire lives. I mean, I can accept that pure and impure might be the cultural map,
Yeah.
but past, present, and future, cause and effect.
I know, it's a lot to take in.
We literally base our justice systems, our daily schedules, and our fundamental sanity on those dualities. You're saying those are just maps.
It's important to clarify that Nāgārjuna is not saying these maps are useless. That is a really crucial trap to avoid.
Okay, so he's not saying throw away your calendar.
No, not at all. These maps are conventionally useful. They were selected, tested, and refined for their immense efficiency over thousands of years of human civilization.
They work on the HUD.
Exactly. Let's say you have a map of the London Underground. It is incredibly useful if you need to get from King's Cross to Waterloo.
Right, I'd be lost without it.
But you can't live inside the map. The map is a two-dimensional schematic. It doesn't contain the smell of the station, the heat of the crowd, or the actual dirt and geology of the Earth above it.
It's a severe reduction.
It's a massive reduction of reality, optimized for one specific task: navigation.
But the problem is we treat the reduction as the ultimate truth. We confuse the schematic for the actual city itself.
We do every single day. Take your example of time, the duality of past, present, and future. We experience time as this rigid, linear framework.
Yeah, moving in one direction.
We believe there is a definitive past that is solidly gone, a present moment that we are stuck inside of, and a future that is yet to arrive. We treat this as absolute territory.
Because it feels undeniably real.
But the text suggests that these temporal frameworks, along with our concept of three-dimensional space, are like illusions, mirages, or echoes.
Mirages.
Yeah, they are there, yet not there. They are conventional tools we use to sequence our experiences. But if you search for an independent, solid entity called the past, you will never find it in the physical universe.
Because it exists only in relation to a perceived present.
Exactly. It's totally relative.
Okay, I can feel the ground starting to get a bit slippery here, but I have to push back hard on one point.
Go for it.
You, or the text, rather, said, all our scientific theories are hypothetical maps too. Wait a minute. Scientific theories put rovers on Mars.
They absolutely do.
We split the atom based on these theories. We eradicate diseases using the scientific method. If Newtonian physics or germ theory are just illusions or hypothetical maps, how do they consistently produce such undeniable physical results in the real world?
It's a really vital pushback.
I mean, I'm struggling to see how science isn't mapping the actual territory.
It trips a lot of people up when they encounter Madhyamaka philosophy, but we have to look at what the source text is actually arguing about knowledge.
Okay, what does it say about science?
The text explicitly says that scientific theories are relatively valid until refuted by counterexamples. It doesn't dismiss them as garbage at all.
Okay, that's a relief.
It acknowledges their immense, unparalleled power in the realm of T1 conventional truth. Science is, without a doubt, the most rigorously tested, highly refined map humanity has ever produced.
So it's the best map we have.
Yes. It is brilliantly effective at predicting how the boundaries we perceive will interact with other boundaries.
I see. So it's accurately predicting how the elements on our heads-up display will behave.
Precisely. When you launch a rover to Mars, you are relying on classical physics, and that is a system that relies on discrete objects, planets, rockets, gravity wells, interacting in a framework of space and time.
And it works. It gets the rover there.
It works phenomenally well within that specific bandwidth of reality, but it is still operating entirely within the HUD.
Because it relies on separating the rocket from the planet.
Exactly. Even Newtonian physics or quantum mechanics are ultimately built on the fundamental assumption of definite boundaries. The assumption that there is a measurable observer and a measurable observed.
Right.
Science maps the behavior of the flux brilliantly, but it cannot capture the suchness, the uncarved, boundaryless reality, because the very tools of science, which are mathematics and language, are inherently dualistic.
I mean, yeah, language and math require separation to function. You can't have an equation without an equal sign separating two distinct values.
That's right.
You can't have a sentence without a noun and a verb.
Exactly. To even say the apple falls to the ground, you must conceptually separate the apple from the tree, from the air it falls through, and from the ground it hits.
You have to draw boxes around them.
Science relies on this separation, but when you push down into the quantum level, as modern physics has discovered, those firm boundaries blur into probabilities and wave functions.
The solid objects just vanish.
They vanish, and you're left with just relationships. And the wild thing is, Nāgārjuna was pointing out this boundaryless reality nearly 2 millennia before quantum mechanics.
That is insane to think about. So we have all these layered maps, the biological maps we evolved just to survive, the linguistic maps we use to communicate, and the scientific maps we use to manipulate matter.
Layers upon layers.
And Nāgārjuna comes along and basically says, let me show you what happens when you stress test these maps.
Yeah.
Which leads us to the core mechanism he uses to break everything down.
Yes, the universal solvent.
Right. In the text, it's described almost like a universal solvent. This was honestly the wildest part of the reading for me.
It is an intellectual tour de force. Across the 27 chapters of the MMK, Nāgārjuna doesn't just present a competing map.
He's not just swapping out the London Underground map for a bus map.
No, he introduces a method that acts like a universal solvent for all maps. He proves logically that if you push any conceptual model, any philosophical stance to its absolute logical limits, it doesn't just bend.
It breaks.
It completely fractures into contradiction and absurdity.
And his surgical blade for this operation is something called the fourfold tetralemma, or katuku. Before we get into what he actually destroys with it,
Yeah.
what is the tetralemma? It sounds like a medieval torture device.
In a way, to the ego, it kind of is. In classical Indian logic, there are 4 possible positions you can take on any given proposition.
Okay, lay them out for me.
Let's call the proposition A.
A exists.
A does not exist.
A both exists and does not exist.
A neither exists nor does not exist.
Okay, in Western logic, we usually just stop at the first 2, right? True or false?
Exactly. But the tetralemma forces you to examine all 4 corners of logical possibility. And what Nāgārjuna does is take any concept, causality, the self, time run it through all 4 positions of the tetralega, and prove that every single one leads to a logical dead end.
That sounds exhausting. Let's methodically walk through how he uses this universal solvent to dismantle the major philosophies we humans cling to.
Let's do it.
Let's start with realism or materialism, because this is the default setting for most of us, right?
Yeah.
The belief that there is an objective physical world out there made of discrete, independent things. How does he destroy the idea of just a simple, solid, physical object?
He attacks it by interrogating that concept of svabhava we talked about, independence or inherent existence.
Right.
Realism assumes things have a core essence that makes them what they are, independently of anything else. Let's take a wooden chair, for example.
Okay, I'm sitting in one right now.
Realism says the chair exists independently in the room, whether we look at it or not. But Nāgārjuna points out the absurdity if you look closely. First, the chair cannot exist without its parts.
The 4 legs, the seat, the back.
Right. If you take all those parts away, where is the chair?
Okay, I see. So the chair is just a label we put on a specific arrangement of parts. But the parts are real, right? I mean, the wood is real.
Keep applying the solvent. The wood cannot exist without the tree it came from.
Fair enough.
The tree cannot exist without the soil, the water, and the sunlight that nourished it. It cannot exist without the carpenter who cut the wood, or the iron that made the carpenter's saw.
So it's just this massive web.
The chair is actually an interception of infinite causes and conditions. Furthermore, it cannot be established without relation to space. It takes up room to time and to an observer whose brain has the concept of something to sit on.
Oh, right, because if a termite encounters the chair, it doesn't see furniture.
Exactly.
It just sees lunch. The chairness is entirely dependent on a human mind projecting a purpose onto it.
Exactly. If you strip away all these dependencies, the parts, the causes, the observer, the space, the time, what is actually left of the independent, inherently existing chair?
It's just conceptually, absolutely nothing.
You cannot find a core chair essence anywhere. Therefore, the first fold of the tetralemma, that physical things inherently exist, is a logical impossibility.
Okay, so if the physical world out there isn't independently real, my mind immediately wants to retreat into the mental world.
That's a very natural reflex.
This was what a lot of philosophers did, right? Pivoting to idealism or solipsism. The whole Descartes approach. I think, therefore I am.
Yes, exactly.
Like, the physical world might be an illusion, but my mind, my consciousness, must be the ultimate reality.
Yeah.
Maybe the universe is just a projection of my consciousness. Does Nāgārjuna let us get away with that?
No, he really doesn't. Idealism tries to make consciousness the absolute territory, the ultimate foundation. But Nāgārjuna applies the exact same solvent to it.
How so?
Idealism claims the mind inherently exists on its own. But a perceiver cannot exist without something being perceived.
Wait, say that again?
Try to have a moment of consciousness right now that isn't conscious of something. It could be a thought, a memory, a feeling, a sound, a visual input. Try to just be conscious of nothing.
I can't. Even if I try to think of nothing, I'm just visualizing a black, empty space in my head.
Which is still an object of thought.
Right. The act of perceiving absolutely requires a target.
Precisely. The perceiver and the perceived arise simultaneously. They are mutually dependent. You cannot have a knower without a known.
Oh, wow.
Therefore, consciousness is entirely dependent on its objects. It has no independent, standalone self-nature. The mind is just another dependently co-arisen map.
So the mental world is just as empty of inherent existence as the physical world.
Exactly.
I gotta say, this is where it starts to feel a little suffocating. Materialism fails because objects depend on everything else. Idealism fails because the mind depends on objects.
It boxes you in.
If both the physical and the mental are stripped away, the mind naturally just panics and swings to the darkest corner. Nihilism,
Yes.
the illusion of absolute vacancy, the second fold of the tetralemma. Nothing exists. Reality is a void. Nothing matters.
Yeah.
I'm assuming he destroys this too.
Nihilism is perhaps the most dangerous trap in this entire philosophical landscape, and Nāgārjuna cuts through it very swiftly.
How does he break that down?
The logical absurdity of nihilism is that it blatantly denies the vivid, functioning flow of conventional appearances.
What do you mean by that?
If truly nothing existed, you couldn't even formulate the philosophy of nihilism. You wouldn't experience the warmth of the sun on your skin, the taste of food, or the pain of stubbing your toe.
Ah. So the map of nihilism contradicts the direct, lived experience of our daily lives.
Yes. Nihilism makes a fundamental category error. It confuses the lack of inherent existence with a lack of any existence whatsoever.
Oh, it's a huge distinction.
Huge. Just because the chair doesn't exist independently doesn't mean you fall through it when you sit down.
Right, it still conventionally functions as a chair.
The dependently co-arisen world functions perfectly well. Nihilism is really just the ego throwing a tantrum because it couldn't find an absolute foundation.
Haha. The ego throwing a tantrum. I love that.
It basically says, well, if I can't have an absolute permanent reality, then nothing is real at all. Nāgārjuna proves that both existence and non-existence are false extremes.
Okay, so we've knocked out the physical world, the mind, and the void. What about monism, the oneness movement? You hear this a lot in modern spiritual circles, right? This idea that everything is just one single absolute substance. We are all one. It feels very profound and, frankly, comforting. Does that survive the solvent?
Monism is a very comforting map, but we must remember it is still just a map. The logical absurdity here is mathematical and conceptual.
Walk me through it.
The concept of one is entirely meaningless without the concept of many.
Because? Why?
You cannot define unity without implicitly contrasting it with multiplicity.
Oh, right. Because if everything is literally one indistinguishable blob, there's no way to even draw a boundary around it to call it one.
Exactly. If everything is truly a single, undivided, absolute substance, there could be no experience, no change, no movement, no interaction at all.
It would just be frozen.
The very fact that you can experience the thought all is one proves there is a duality between the thinker and the thought.
Mind blown.
Monism is just taking the duality of one and many, picking the side that feels nicer, and trying to crown it as the ultimate truth. It's just another concept the mind is trying to use as a solid foundation.
I'm going to zero in on one final philosophy here, one that I really thought might survive this gauntlet. Processism or relationism.
Okay, let's look at that.
If independent things aren't real and the mind isn't real, what about the connections between things? What if reality is just pure flux, a web of relationships, no nouns, just verbs? This sounds very close to what you were saying earlier about the continuous wave of reality.
It is a highly sophisticated map, I'll give it that. It's much closer to the truth than materialism or nihilism, but Nāgārjuna's logic remains totally unyielding.
He breaks this too.
Think about what a relationship actually is. A relationship is strictly impossible without separate entities to relate to one another.
Well, I mean, you cannot have a collision without two cars.
Right.
You cannot have a conversation without two speakers.
Correct. You cannot have a connection without two nodes to connect. If the entities themselves, the cars, the speakers, the nodes, are completely empty of inherent existence, then the relations between them must also be empty.
Because they're connecting illusions.
You cannot build an absolute foundation out of connections between things that don't inherently exist. You can't bridge two mirages.
Wow.
Even the concept of flux, or the process itself, if viewed as an absolute foundation, falls apart. Because if there are no things to change, what is changing?
Wow. Okay, so if we look at the wreckage here, all of our philosophical nouns are destroyed. The material world, the self, the mind, all of our philosophical verbs and relationships are destroyed. Process, connection, causality. The tetralemma leaves absolutely no survivors.
Not at all.
We are just in a state of conceptual freefall, which forces us into a very difficult corner. If all the maps are erased, if we drop all these false boundaries, what is actually left? What does the actual territory look like?
When we try to describe the territory reality as it is, we run into a massive, unavoidable problem, and that is language.
Because language is a map.
Language is inherently a map. It requires nouns, verbs, subjects, and objects to function. So the text explicitly states that any words used to describe the ultimate territory are merely temporary antidotes.
Temporary antidotes, like medicine.
Exactly. They are medicines to cure our habit of freezing the world. They are not absolute descriptions. We have to use words to point to something beyond words.
The text provides a string of adjectives for this territory, and it's quite a list. It describes it as an inconceivable, limitless, centerless, nonlinear, multidimensional, holographic, fractal, karmic cycle, or flux.
It's a mouthful.
That is a heavy, almost psychedelic list of words. Let's
Yeah.
break down why it uses these specific terms. Why centerless, for instance?
Centerless is crucial here. If there are no absolute boundaries, as we've established, then there is no fixed point to measure anything from.
Okay, that makes sense physically.
To have a center, you must have a circumference, an edge. Without edges, every single point is equally the center, or there is no center at all. It points to a reality that doesn't orbit around your ego or the earth or any particular framework.
And holographic and fractal. That makes it sound like we're in a simulation.
Not a simulation in the sci-fi sense, no, but a system of total infinite interdependence.
How does that work?
Think about a fractal. In a fractal, the pattern of the whole is repeated in every single tiny part. In a hologram, if you break the photographic plate, every single tiny shard still contains the entire image.
Oh, right. I've heard that about holograms.
In this philosophy, because everything is dependently co-arisen, every single phenomenon contains the implications of the entire universe. A single drop of rain contains the story of the oceans, the sun, gravity, and the atmosphere.
It is an ocean of total interdependence with absolutely no substantiality.
No independent nouns, no standalone verbs, just dynamic, interconnected arising.
The text refers to this as the rushing river of cause and effect, right? The T1 flux.
Yes, conventionally, it appears to be flowing. Things appear to be happening, seasons change, people are born and die.
But
Ultimately, it is completely devoid of fixed, independent entities. That's the T2 flux.
I'm trying to visualize this because it's so incredibly counterintuitive to our savannah brains. Our brains want to grab onto something solid.
They desperately want that.
It's like
Yeah.
trying to hand someone a running without a runner. We're trying to hand them a wave without the ocean. We are so utterly obsessed with the nouns, the runner, the water, that we completely miss the action, the dynamic, interdependent arising.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
We want to grab the wave, put a label on it, and stick it in a bucket to keep it safe.
Yeah.
But the moment we scoop it up and isolate it, it ceases to be a wave. It just becomes stagnant water in a bucket.
Look at how that plays out in human behavior, though. That desire to scoop the wave into a bucket is exactly what our minds do to reality every single second of our lives.
We're bucket hoarders.
The wave only exists as a temporary expression of the entire ocean's movement. The wind, the gravitational pull of the moon, the currents beneath the surface. It has no independent, isolated existence.
Right.
If you isolate it, you kill its essence. And this compulsion to isolate, label, and freeze the fluid world is the bridge between this massive philosophical framework and our actual daily lives.
Which brings us right to the root of human suffering. We've spent a lot of time tearing down high-level philosophy. But how does this connect directly to me, like sitting in traffic or stressing about my mortgage?
It connects entirely.
According to this text, the root of all human suffering, what Buddhism calls dukkha, is a very specific mental action called reification, or in Sanskrit, samarapa. What exactly is reification?
Reification is the fatal flaw of human cognition. It is the act of taking those dependently co-arisen maps we've been talking about, those conventional tools, and treating them as if they were the absolute territory.
So confusing the menu for the meal.
Yes. It is projecting inherent, solid, permanent existence onto things that are actually fluid, temporary, and interdependent. It is trying to squeeze the limitless fractal ocean into our neat, rigid little matchboxes.
Because as you mentioned earlier, the unmapped reality is terrifying to the ego.
It's terrifying. The open, ungrounded, boundaryless reality is deeply unsettling to a brain that evolved to seek safety in solid boundaries. We prefer to live in our mental maps.
Even if the maps make us miserable.
Even then, we cling to our conditioning, our opinions, and our personal histories because the map feels familiar and safe, even if it's painful. We demand that the chaotic universe fit into our binaries. Right and wrong, success and failure, mine and yours.
And reality doesn't care about our binary.
Not at all. And when the fluid, ungraspable reality inevitably violates those rigid boxes, When we lose a job, when a relationship ends, when our bodies age, we suffer immensely. We suffer because reality refuses to obey our maps.
Okay, let's make this highly practical. Let's look at a mundane, high-stress situation. Let's say I'm at work, and my boss calls me into a meeting and yells at me in front of the whole team for a mistake I made.
A classic stressor.
Right. My heart rate spikes, my face flushes, I feel intense shame, anger, and absolute fear about losing my job. That physiological and emotional response feels incredibly, undeniably real in my body.
Of course it does.
Are you saying my stress in that moment is just me mistaking my job map and my boss map for ultimate reality? Am I just suffering because of a map error?
If we trace the logic of the text into that scenario, yes. Let's separate the map from the territory.
Hey, let's break it down.
The conventional interaction is certainly happening. Sound waves are traveling from your boss's vocal cords to your ears. Your brain processes the tone and volume. That is the conventional flux.
The T1.
Exactly. But where does the sticky, lingering suffering come from? The suffering comes from the suffocating, heavy layer of inherent existence that you unconsciously project onto every single element of that exit.
So the reification. Walk me through how I'm reifying that specific moment.
In that moment of panic, you reify the boss. You cease to see them as a complex, dependently arisen human being who might be under pressure from their own superiors, sleep-deprived, or reacting to their own conditioning.
Right, they just become a monster.
You freeze them into a solid, inherently angry, powerful, separate entity, an absolute adversary.
And what about me?
Simultaneously, you reify yourself. You freeze your fluid identity into an inherently victimized, vulnerable, incompetent, separate entity.
Ouch. But yeah, that's exactly what happened.
You reify the Job. You project upon this arbitrary socioeconomic arrangement the absolute foundation of your survival and self-worth.
So I've turned everything into statues.
You freeze the dynamic, interdependent flux of a Tuesday afternoon office interaction into terrifying, immovable statues.
And because they feel like solid statues, they feel like they can crush me.
Exactly. But if you could view the event without those dualistic glasses, if you could see the boss's anger as a temporary phenomenon dependently arisen from countless causes, if you could see your physiological reaction as just a biological response passing through the nervous system, the event would still happen.
The boss would still be yelling.
The sound waves would still hit your ears. But the deep, sticky suffering, the dukkha, would evaporate. The suffering is not in the event itself. The suffering is entirely generated by the map-making machinery of the mind.
That is incredibly profound. Just realizing that the heavy, solid feeling of trauma, stress, or anxiety is actually an active projection of my own mind trying to freeze a fluid situation. I mean, it shifts the entire burden of suffering.
It gives you the power back.
Now, tracing this logical path, I know what a lot of listeners might be thinking.
What's that?
They might think, okay, I get it. The physical world is just a map. My daily life, my job, my ego, they're all just painful maps. Therefore, the logical solution must be to abandon the physical world.
The ascetic route.
Right? I need to renounce society, retreat to a cave, meditate all day, and seek refuge in pure spiritual concepts. I need to find the absolute truth of emptiness or nirvana.
Yes.
But this is where Nāgārjuna springs his greatest trap, doesn't he?
Yeah.
We arrive at what we could call the ultimate paradox.
This is truly where Nāgārjuna separates himself from almost every other philosopher and mystic in human history. It is his ultimate masterstroke.
What does he do?
Throughout the MMK, he systematically pulls the rug out from under the physical and conceptual world, as we've seen. And just when your mind frantically tries to step onto the spiritual world for safety, looking for a holy foundation, he pulls that rug out too.
He leaves us fallen.
He leaves us absolutely no ground to stand on, not even the holy ground of Buddhism itself.
In the text, this is referred to as the emptiness of emptiness, right?
Yes. In ultimate reality, there is no absolute territory, no final foundation, no ultimate ground to grasp, attain, or worship.
Which is wild for a religious text to say.
The text details how even the most sacred, high-level spiritual concepts are just maps. It dissects foundational Buddhist doctrines, concepts that practitioners base their entire lives upon.
Like what? The text mentions a lot of complex terms here. Let's break them down so we understand exactly what he's dismantling. It mentions the two truths.
The doctrine of the two truths, the idea that there is a conventional truth, the map, and an ultimate truth, emptiness. Nāgārjuna says this doctrine itself is empty. It's just a pedagogical tool.
It's just a teaching aid. What else?
It mentions the ground and its manifestations, the idea that there is an ultimate source of reality from which everything springs. Empty. just another attempt to find a first cause.
Okay.
It mentions the three kayas, the concept of the three bodies of the Buddha, which is the ultimate spiritual framework for enlightenment, empty,
Wow.
and it mentions the three gems of Buddha, Dharma, which are the teachings, and Sangha, the spiritual community. Even these are explicitly described as being like mirages or echoes.
Wait, I have to stop you there because conceptually, this is a massive rug pull. He is telling Buddhist monks that the Buddha, the teachings, and the concept of emptiness itself are illusions.
That is exactly what he's saying.
So, turning emptiness or the flux into a new absolute truth, treating it as a new religion or a sacred destination, is just making the exact same mistake we made with materialism. We just swapped a physical map for a spiritual map.
That is precisely the trap he is warning against. If you reify emptiness, you have missed the entire point of the philosophy.
It's actually the map maker who has spent his whole life navigating a city using a specific map.
Okay, let's hear the analogy.
One day, he has an epiphany and realizes his map is totally fake. The streets on the paper don't match the actual city at all.
Right, he sees through the illusion.
But instead of throwing the map away and actually going out to explore the real concrete city, he is so terrified of being without a map that he decides to frame the blank back of the piece of paper, hangs it on his wall, and starts worshiping the blank paper as the ultimate truth.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it. Worshipping the blank paper. Making emptiness a source, a god, or an ultimate resting place is just mistaking a highly subtle spiritual map for the territory.
The paper is still just paper.
Exactly. Emptiness itself is empty of inherent existence. It is not a black hole. It is not a magical ether. Emptiness is simply a conceptual tool used to deconstruct other conceptual tools.
It's just another tool.
Think of it like a medicine. If you have an illness, the disease of reification, of seeing things as solid, emptiness is the medicine that cures it. But once the disease is cured, you don't keep swallowing the medicine.
That would make you sick again.
If you swallow the medicine of emptiness after you are cured, it becomes a new poison. You have to drop the concept of emptiness too. Otherwise, you're just trapped in a new, slightly more transparent spiritual box.
Which brings us to the final beautiful horizon of this text. If all physical maps are false and all spiritual maps are false, if there is no foundation, no void, no absolute oneness, and absolutely no ground to stand on anywhere in the universe, what on earth is liberation?
That is the ultimate question.
What is the point of all this deconstruction? This leads us to how Nāgārjuna redefines nirvāna, navigating the river with transparent glasses.
We have to completely redefine what liberation means based on this framework. Most spiritual traditions frame liberation as an escape.
Right, you get away from the bad stuff.
You escape the dirty, painful physical world and ascend to a pure, perfect spiritual realm. But if there is no ground, then nirvāna cannot be a place you go.
There's nowhere to go.
There is no finish line. There is no final effect to produce through meditation, no complete static purification, and no final state called cessation where you just blink out of existence and escape the cycle.
Because trying to escape reality is just another form of rejecting the territory.
Exactly. So what is nirvāna? The text makes a radical equation. Samsara, the everyday, painful, chaotic world of birth, death, jobs, traffic, and mundane life, is structurally identical to nirvāna.
Structurally identical.
The only difference is your perception. Nirvāna is simply living fully in samsara while being completely aware of the true empty nature and dynamic of samsara.
It's not about changing the world. It's about changing how you view the world.
Yes.
It's taking off those heavy, dualistic, reifying glasses and putting on transparent ones.
You are accepting the absolute fluidity of the river without trying to freeze it. What is so deeply liberating, so incredibly practical about this ancient philosophy is that it doesn't demand you destroy your life.
Right, I don't have to quit my job.
You don't have to burn down your house and live in a forest. We don't have to destroy our maps or reject our tools. You can still use the map of your job, your family, your schedule, your bank account, and even your science.
We just use them conventionally?
We use them conventionally. We paint, we navigate, and we communicate with them to benefit ourselves and others. But we do it with a light touch.
We hold them loosely.
We hold them loosely, knowing fundamentally that they are dreamlike fabrications. We engage with the world passionately, but without the desperate, heavy grasping that causes suffering.
It reminds me of the experience of watching a beautifully directed movie in a theater.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
You sit in the dark, and you can be completely immersed in the story. You can cry at the sad parts, you can laugh at the jokes, you can feel genuine tension during an action scene. You are fully participating in the emotional reality of the film.
You're not detached.
Right. But in the very back of your mind, you never, ever forget that it's just light projected onto a two-dimensional screen.
Yeah.
Because you have that underlying awareness. You don't jump out of your seat, run down the aisle, and try to physically save the characters on the screen.
And that unmediated awareness is the key. That awareness alone is what dissolves the obsessions, unwinds the defensive karma, and stops the suffering.
You just watch the movie.
You are still in the theater of life. You still feel the emotions. But you stop fighting the flux. You stop trying to squeeze the ocean of reality into a conceptual matchbox. And you finally, simply, learn how to swim in the open water.
That is an incredible place to bring this massive deep dive to a close.
Yeah.
Let's try to summarize the journey we've taken today.
It's been quite a ride.
It really has. The central thesis we've explored is deceptively simple to say, but it clearly takes a lifetime to truly realize. The map is not the territory.
Right.
We started with the evolutionary edge detection of our savanna brains, hardwired to invent boundaries just for survival. We looked at how we built our rigid concepts of time, space, and science on top of those false boundaries.
And then we took a sledgehammer to it.
Yeah, we watched Nāgārjuna use the fourfold tetralemma to systematically destroy every philosophical foundation we cling to: materialism, idealism, nihilism, and monism.
No survival.
None. We learned that the root of our suffering is reification, our desperate attempt to freeze a dynamic, fractal, holographic river into solid, safe objects. And finally, we saw that even the concept of emptiness is just a map, leading us to the realization that true liberation, true nirvana, isn't an escape from the world, but a way of living within it lightly, without grasping.
The beautiful, practical takeaway from all of this heavy deconstruction is just absolute freedom.
Freedom from the maps.
Exactly. You can use the incredible tools of the human mind without becoming a slave to them. You can learn to abide in the uncarved territory of suchness, experiencing the vivid, dynamic flow of your life without the heavy burden of projection and fear.
Before we sign off, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own.
A parting gift.
We started this journey by talking about how our prehistoric brains evolved to use edge detection to separate self from other just to survive the physical dangers of the savannah.
The biological trap.
But think about this. What happens to the very concept of you in those quiet, incredibly mundane moments when you aren't doing anything at all?
When the brain isn't busy.
Right. When you simply sit on a bench and observe a single breath entering and leaving your body in that split second where you aren't defending a physical boundary, you aren't analyzing a social threat, and you aren't projecting a timeline into the future.
What's left?
If you stop drawing boundaries for just 1 second, does the independent self temporarily cease to exist? Does the map of who you think you are simply dissolve right back into the rushing river?
That's the real question.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. See you next time.